Loneliness is not a void. It is a lens through which reality reveals itself to those who dare to observe without distraction. While others flounder in the endless sea of superficial alliances, the few who walk alone understand a truth that society fears intimacy is often a cage, friendship a currency too cheap to hold true value. To possess few or no companions is not a mark of weakness, it is the signature of a mind untethered from the collective illusions of conformity. It is rare because it requires an intellectual independence that most are unwilling to pay for, a psychological cost too heavy for the ordinary ego. Humans are not designed to embrace absence. They crave validation, proximity, approval. The masses surrender themselves to the rhythm of social necessity, trading authenticity for acceptance, silence for chatter, freedom for a semblance of belonging. But those who walk without a crowd have mastered a subtle, dangerous advantage, the ability to exist without external validation. In the eyes of others, they appear strange, cold, even unapproachable. In truth, they are strategically detached. Every choice, every action is filtered through the lens of internal logic, not the fickle tides of social whim. Consider the psychological mechanics of companionship. Friendship, at its core, is transactional. Shared laughter, shared history, shared trust. All instruments of mutual influence, binding two egos into a fragile architecture of dependency. Few understand the vulnerability embedded in such connections, envy concealed as admiration, influence disguised as support, loyalty that bends at the first gust of ambition. Those who avoid the clutter of common allegiance preserve their autonomy. They do not merely exist, they operate. Their perceptions remain unsullied, their emotional economy intact, their strategies uncompromised. Isolation, then, is not deprivation. It is an amplifier of perception. In silence, the mind observes patterns invisible to the distracted multitudes. Conversations are dissected, motives analyzed, behavior reduced to its elemental drives. One learns to see through pretense, to anticipate deceit, to recognize the subtle architecture of manipulation. The human mind is a battlefield of impulses, and the solitary strategist has the clarity to navigate it without distortion. Power, after all, is less often wielded through numbers than through control of perception. To understand others without becoming entangled in their influence is to wield influence silently and visibly. Yet this path demands sacrifice. It exacts a toll upon the ego, demanding a constant vigilance against loneliness masquerading as freedom. Many mistake the absence of friends for social failure. The rare individual discerns the distinction. Freedom is not the absence of company, it is the absence of compromise. In relinquishing the trivial bonds that chain others to conformity, they acquire a rare clarity of mind, a precision in thought, a sovereignty over internal states that cannot be bargained or borrowed. They become, in essence, untouchable, not in the sense of invincibility, but in the sense that their inner world cannot be coerced, their attention cannot be bought, their identity cannot be diluted. These rare traits, the capacity to endure absence, to observe without reaction, to value perception above companionship, are the markers of a mind operating on a higher plane. They are the hidden currencies of power that most will never earn because most are too afraid to face the stillness required to see clearly. The world, in its obsession with sociability, mistakes the solitary for the defective, the detached for the antisocial. But the truth is more unsettling. To walk alone is to perceive deeply, to strategize quietly, to live without surrender. In these traits lies not mere survival, but domination, the mastery of one's own narrative, one's own value, one's own presence in a world that mistakes noise for significance. In the sections that follow, we will dissect this architecture of the solitary mind. Each trait, each rare quality, is a stage in the internal transformation of those few who possess it. We will examine how the mind reacts when untethered from collective expectation, how identity fractures and reforms under pressure, how emotional sovereignty becomes an invisible weapon. And we will confront the unsettling truth that those who walk alone are not lonely. They are quietly, ruthlessly superior. The solitary individual develops an acute sense of perception that those wrapped in the comfort of constant companionship cannot comprehend. Every glance, every word, every hesitation becomes data, a fragment of intention waiting to be deciphered. Without friends to cushion the psyche, the mind learns to interpret reality unfiltered, stripped of emotional distortion. Observation becomes a weapon, not a passive act. In this absence, the human psyche sharpens, discerning patterns in behavior that others only superficially register. Attachment, even subtle, is a chain disguised as intimacy. It colors judgment, compromises clarity, and blinds the ego to exploitation. Those who walk alone experience the opposite, a freedom to witness without surrender, to assess without interference, to predict without fear. The human mind, when deprived of the constant echo of approval, develops a quiet, analytical dominance. It sees envy lurking behind smiles, insecurity masked by laughter, and ambition cloaked as camaraderie. This stage is not merely intellectual, it is profoundly psychological. Isolation forces the ego to confront itself, to measure its value independently of external reflection. The solitary mind endures the subtle assaults of comparison, the quiet whispers of social exclusion, without faltering. Each slight, each ignored call, each absence of recognition is transformed into data, reinforcing internal sovereignty. The mind that observes without attachment becomes a silent strategist, understanding that control resides less in influence over others than in mastery over self-perception. In this crucible, identity is no longer defined by the acceptance of others, but by the rigor of self-awareness. The rare individual cultivates a psychological armor, impervious to manipulation, immune to the subtle erosion of autonomy. The observer thrives in absence because absence is not emptiness, it is the space where strategy, clarity, and dominance converge. In this stage, the mind begins its metamorphosis, untethered, precise, and quietly lethal. The absence of companions does not weaken the self, it sculpts it. Stripped of constant social validation, the ego is forced to confront its own contours, to measure its worth in silence rather than applause. In the quiet, the mind evaluates its desires, its ambitions, its failures, unfiltered by the distortions of collective approval. Each thought becomes deliberate, each decision a reflection of internal authority, rather than borrowed consensus. The solitary individual learns a form of self-reliance so precise it borders on ruthlessness. The ego no longer begs for recognition, it commands its own respect. This stage is a crucible of psychological resilience. When others constantly reinforce identity, the ego grows complacent, fragile, and easily manipulated. Deprived of these reinforcements, it either collapses or emerges refined, honed into a tool of strategic thought. The solitary mind chooses the latter. It learns to absorb slights as lessons, envy as a mirror, and neglect as an indicator of societal weakness. Emotional turbulence is measured, dissected, and repurposed. It becomes fuel for self-mastery rather than distraction. In this environment, the rare traits of autonomy and clarity deepen. The mind no longer reacts, it anticipates. Social dynamics that once confused and entangled are now predictable, transparent in their motives and vulnerabilities. The absence of friends, once mistaken as deficiency, becomes a deliberate advantage. The solitary ego observes the illusions of friendship, the fragility of loyalty, and the performative nature of companionship, and it remains untouched. By refining the ego in solitude, the mind gains a subtle dominance over reality itself. Decisions are no longer swayed by the approval of others, nor by fear of rejection. Power is internalized. The individual walks through life with a silent authority, not broadcast through volume or charm, but through the calculated precision of thought and the unassailable confidence of self-containment. In this stage, solitude ceases to be a condition. It becomes an instrument, a rare trait that transforms absence into dominance. Walking alone does not equate to weakness. It is a camouflage, a calculated disappearance from the chaos of collective influence. The solitary mind becomes an invisible strategist, observing the movements of others without interference, predicting outcomes without exposure. In a world obsessed with social visibility, invisibility is power. Every interaction is studied, every motive passed, and every weakness catalogued, all without the need for recognition. The few who possess this trait understand that true influence is not always broadcast. It often operates unseen, like the subtle pressure of gravity shaping the course of rivers. The solitary individual recognizes the fragility of human loyalty. Bonds are seldom built on principle. They are built on convenience, fear, or desire. By remaining absent, by refusing the constant engagement that chains others to dependence, the mind escapes the predictable traps of manipulation. It watches as egos rise and fracture, as envy simmers beneath polite smiles, and as ambition masks itself as friendship. In this stage, every social encounter becomes a laboratory, a space where human nature is dissected with clinical precision. The psychological transformation here is subtle but profound. Without the distraction of social obligation, the mind internalizes control over its own emotional reactions. Others act, react, provoke, and manipulate, yet the solitary observer remains untouched. Their presence is deliberate, their silence strategic, their absence disarming. In a society where attention is currency, to withhold it is to hold power. The human desire to be acknowledged, to belong, becomes an invisible lever that the solitary mind can exploit without uttering a word. By the end of this stage, the mind has evolved into a quiet authority, capable of navigating human behavior with surgical exactness. It sees the mechanics of influence while remaining immune to them, understanding that the true measure of power is not in the number of allies one claims, but in the precision of perception, the discipline of the ego, and the dominance of internal control. Here, solitude is no longer an absence, it is an unseen architecture of dominance, shaping both self and the world without ever announcing its presence. Solitude is not only a shield, it is a mirror. The few who walk alone begin to see themselves reflected in the obsessions and insecurities of others. Those who crave friendship, validation, and proximity reveal their desires openly, often unknowingly exposing the fragility that the solitary mind has long transcended. Envy, projection, and dependence become instruments through which the rare individual measures their own authority. The world, in its neediness, illuminates the strengths of the one who refuses to comply. This stage reveals a subtle, psychological advantage. The absence of friends forces others to confront the rarity of independence. They attempt to draw the solitary individual into games they cannot win, to provoke reactions they will never see. Their obsession, their frustration, their silent calculations are all visible to the mind that has learned to observe without attachment. Each failed attempt at manipulation reinforces the quiet dominance of the one who has chosen absence over acquiescence. Projection becomes a tool of clarity. When others interpret solitude as loneliness, need, or deficiency, they betray not the isolated mind's weakness, but their own. In their assumptions, their judgments, their efforts to compel engagement, they reveal the psychological architecture of dependence. The solitary individual requires no manipulation, no social finesse. The world projects its vulnerabilities, and the observer merely catalogues them. In this stage, the ego of the solitary mind is no longer reactive. It has internalized power through observation, absence, and self-reliance. Emotional economy is precise, decisions are unclouded, and presence itself becomes a force. Influence flows indirectly, a byproduct of understanding rather than effort. In this psychological equilibrium, solitude is not deprivation, it is mastery. The world's noise, desire, and weakness are tools for the rare few who can endure absence without compromise, who can see the mechanics of human dependency while remaining untouchable, unseen, and strategically dominant. Prolonged absence of companionship strips away the superficial layers that the world clings to, the roles, the performances, the borrowed identities. In solitude, the mind is confronted with its raw essence, unmasked and unmediated. The individual begins to experience a fracture of identity, not destructive, but purifying. Every habit, every attachment, every expectation imposed by others is scrutinized, tested, and either discarded or integrated on its own merit. This is not self-improvement, it is the cold reconstruction of the self, a deliberate architecture of autonomy. Fear, the most subtle and corrosive of human motivators, becomes a tool for refinement. When the ego is isolated from social affirmation, fear is confronted directly, fear of insignificance, of rejection, of being unseen. The solitary mind does not succumb, it absorbs the pressure, studies its patterns, and adapts. Each encounter with absence becomes a lesson in internal governance. Anxiety that would paralyze the ordinary mind is transformed into calculated vigilance. The individual learns to anticipate, to measure, to endure without complaint or compromise. In this crucible, identity is forged into a weapon. It no longer relies on the echo of approval, nor the validation of companionship. The self becomes a locus of authority, a domain immune to manipulation, a fortress of perception. Others, when they encounter this rare presence, instinctively sense its power. There is no overt display, no effort to dominate. The authority is implicit, unavoidable. Obsession and desire, envy and intrigue ripple around the solitary figure, while the mind remains detached, observing without attachment, controlling without force. By the end of this stage, the individual has transformed absence into dominion. Solitude is no longer a condition to endure, it is a lens, a strategy, a rare trait that grants control over both internal and external worlds. The mind that has survived this stage is unassailable, precise and calibrated to the mechanisms of influence. Identity is no longer borrowed, it is claimed. Fear is no longer a threat, it is mastered. And the rare individual begins to realize a truth few ever comprehend. Power resides not in numbers, nor in presence, but in the silent, unwavering command of the self. In the absence of friends, in the silence that others flee from, a terrifying clarity emerges. Most humans are fragile, reactive, and endlessly malleable. They define themselves by others' approval, chase the hollow rewards of attention, and surrender autonomy for the illusion of connection. The solitary individual sees this with unflinching precision, recognizing that influence is often a byproduct of restraint, that dominance does not demand numbers but comprehension. To walk alone is to become impervious to the constant erosion of identity that afflicts the many. This stage reveals the darkest truth. Power resides not in force, charm, or alliances, but in self-mastery. Those who have few or no companions are not deficient, they are rare because they have endured what most cannot. The collapse of external validation and the relentless confrontation with their own mind. In solitude, every fear is confronted, every desire measured, every reaction controlled. This is the architecture of authority, invisible yet absolute. The world's neediness, envy, and projection become instruments, not obstacles. Every human weakness becomes data, every expectation a lever for silent influence. The final transformation is psychological, existential, and merciless. The solitary mind cultivates dominance over perception itself. It moves through social spaces untouchable, unassailable, and unconcerned with the judgments of others. Emotional economy is perfected, the ego is sovereign. The individual has become a quiet force, feared not for aggression, but for the impossibility of intrusion. Influence, when it arrives, is not sought, it radiates, a natural consequence of discipline, detachment, and clarity. In this rare state, loneliness is no longer experienced. It has been transmuted into autonomy, observation into strategy, absence into mastery. The haunting truth lingers. Most will never understand this power, for most cannot endure it. But those who do walk alone hold a sovereignty beyond the reach of superficial alliances. They are unshakable, precise, and quietly supreme. And in the stillness of their rare existence, they confront a philosophical certainty: the only allegiance worth possessing is to the self, the only authority unquestionable is internal, and the only power absolute is that which cannot be compromised by others.